Okay, welcome everyone. This week we're going to do something a little different than what we normally do. This is going to be a stream with a couple coworkers of mine, Grant Erickson, who is the CTO at IntelliTect, and then Andrew Scott, who is one of the, I'll call him principal lead developers on the Coalesce project. So last week I'd kind of briefly mentioned it, sort of in passing, and people seem to be interested in it. So we are going to dive in and see what they have. So since this is not my area of expertise, I'm going to let them basically show off how awesome it is and let them go. So, gentlemen, let me switch over and away you go. Grant, Andrew, welcome. Thank you for coming and putting up with me.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
So if you're only seeing Grant, that's expected. Andrew is having camera problems, but his is the screen that's driving. So Grant, is there anything else I missed that you'd like to add or introduce yourself?
I guess that's probably a pretty good place to start. I guess we can talk about this a little bit, and then we'll do some kind of examples, demo stuff, and show you how it works. If you want to follow along, you can. So yeah, we just talk a little bit about how it can be. So I've been developing software for a long time, over 30 years, and web development for quite a while. And so after I built, and this is probably true of a lot of things, Kevin, I think you have the same thing, and I know Andrew does too, is that you build something like, even with WPF, which I think we're actually supposed to be talking about on this channel, but we're going to talk about web today. But when you actually develop something, it's really fun. The first time you're learning all this stuff, you do it again, you feel like you're better, and then you do it the fifth or sixth time, and then I'm tired of writing drop down. And I'm tired of writing when I write a drop down, because when I write a drop down, they want type ahead, and they want all of these features that make software awesome. I don't like to write all of middle stuff. So I got really bored of writing middle software. I really love design, and I really love front end, user interface, things like that. But after a while, some of the middle stuff, it's like, oh wow, I have to build an API, and I have to build some JavaScript, and I have to bind it to my controls, and all of these different pieces. And so that part got boring. And we came up to a project where we're going to have to build an application, I guess, that was this one screen, or this one kind of section of the application was going to have over 100 that you had to fill out, or you could fill out, like some optional kind of forms just to collect a ton of data from the person. So I cannot write this. I am not going to do this. Coalesce was born out of that, kind of Coalesce things together and making it kind of solid. So I guess Andrew has all these great things here. It says come together and form one. That's what we're trying to do. With Coalesce. So I'll introduce to Andrew. So Andrew while I kind of kicked off Coalesce, Andrew's really been one of the primary developers on it for the past few years. And initially, the software was designed to be run in Knockout, because that's kind of the land where we started. And then after that, we moved on and said, hey, what kind of fits? And we really found that Vue was really the best fit. And so when we do things tonight, you're going to knock out of some of the older apps that we've written with it. Fully supports that, really a simple data binding process. If you wanted to use something like that, although I think at this point we'd recommend using something like Vue, which is more of a SPA piece, but it's not quite so opinionated as things like Angular. Anyway, Andrew, do you want to say anything to kind of kick us off?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a great place to start talking along the lines of talking about Vue and Knockout and different web frameworks and kind of the choices that we made, making Coalesce and picking the web front-end frameworks to base it on. Knockout, of course, was the first choice. Knockout was a great option and a great solution for us there for a long time, but it just kind of didn't. It hasn't aged very well. It's kind of everybody's just sort of moved on to newer pastures.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody's really making cool stuff for Knockout anymore, cool components or anything like that. But Vue is a great a great spiritual successor to Knockout when you put it in comparison with Angular and when you compare it with React, kind of the way that Vue works fundamentally with tracking reactivity is very similar to the way that Knockout does it. Of course, Knockout does it with observables, which are these functions that you have to call. Either call it with no arguments to get a value out of it, or call it with an argument to give a value to it. Vue kind of does that all under the hood for you, so you don't have all this stuff and your code is littered with parentheses everywhere you turn.
Well, you gotta love those things, man.
Yeah, don't you love it? So that's kind of when we're looking at front end frameworks, and this will kind of all make a lot more sense as we get more into what Coalesce is and how to use it. But that's why we went with Vue as opposed to say Angular or React for this.
Right. Yeah, that's great. The real idea here is that we wanted to take and put the fun stuff back in. And so essentially you write a data model and then it builds out all the stuff up to your front end. It builds your API layers and all that. And we should probably throw a little picture up here. We have a few slides. Let's just go through the slides real quick. That way I don't forget stuff. Let's pop to the next one if you would, Andrew. Okay, so web development's too hard. We talked about that. What does it do? So essentially, it's like, let's do the fun stuff. Let's do the stuff where we have to think. Let's do the pieces where we really have to put our creativity into the process. And the parts where we don't have to think as much, like building out parts of the API service. Like, for example, if I'm going to build a dropdown that allows me to search and select an object from somewhere else in my object model to link in as a foreign key for my database, I mean, that can be a fair amount of code to build that piece of that code that does that. The actual functionality can be difficult. And so it builds out the API controllers and things like that. And so what Knockout really tries to, or not what Knockout, what Coalesce really tries to do is builds out those pieces. So it builds out DTOs, so data transfer objects, so the objects on the client side that are typically all nullable properties and things like that. It does all your security checking and security trimming in and out. It builds TypeScript models and the view models for all your objects and lists. You can really easily do things on the client with your data. And then it builds a set of admin views, because we found that almost every app we wrote, we needed some way to go in and just look through the database behind it. And really just a caveat, Coalesce is really designed for, and not really necessarily forms over data, but database backend, web front end. If you're doing something else, there's probably other tools that are better. And even if you're doing this, there may be tools that are better than Coalesce. It's good for certain things. We found that for line of business applications and things like that, it works great. And these admin views are basically just a way to say, hey, for every table in the database, I need to be able to see them and filter them, sort them, be able to page through my data, search for different things, and have that all be really easy and just built right out of the box for you. So, and then some helpers to be able to do nice, easy bindings, to get drop-down lists and different kinds of nice stuff that you would use just in your application. So you can get more to building your app and building your data models and building your classes and building custom interfaces and things like that, and spend less time doing a lot of boilerplate work, which unfortunately in the state that we're in right now, if you want to write a website, I would say at least 50% of what you're doing is what I would consider boilerplate work, which is just plumbing things from the server to the client and from the client to the server. So I guess, is there a little picture that comes up next, Andrew? Do you want to add anything to that?
There sure is. No, I think that's a great summary of it.
I just talked about all the stuff on the slide, so it should be pretty easy.
And there's quite a bit on this slide here too. So I'm going to just make sure that I've got this straight. So for people who are unfamiliar, I am not a great web developer. I think both Grant and Andrew will agree with that statement when I say that. So just to be clear, so when we're talking about going through this, it's the you build up at the top, right? So it's I get to pick the layout of my site, my styling, how my TypeScript or Vue code works, right? And then ultimately, and work our way up.
Let's start at the bottom. Why don't you start down there first? Work your way up.
So start at the bottom. I build out my entity framework DB context. I build out my various entity POCOs, right? Lay those out.
Yep.
Right.
POCOs. And you can even put functions on your POCOs. Like if I have a function that does something, and all of your functions and methods and things like that will be extended, if you want, extended out to the client so you can call them from the client.
And so then it's going to generate the C# web APIs for me and all of those things. So I don't need to worry about building the DTOs for the transfer on the wire down to the client.
Yep.
Right? And then it generates all of the TypeScript clients, so very like Swagger client AutoGen-esque, I assume, in that area.
Right, except a little more than that. I mean, you're going to get more because
they're
it's going to have.
They're a lot more intelligent. They're more specific to kind of a CRUD situation. So the view models in this case are stateful objects that are kind of aware of things like foreign key relationships, and they're aware that they can be saved and that they can be deleted and that they can be related to other things. So it's not just, simply a method that wraps an API endpoint. It's an object with a bunch of methods that wrap API endpoints, but also a lot of other useful things as well.
So now there is just the, hey, let's wrap the API endpoint. That's a layer as well, but there's also this layer of statefulness on your client. So I can basically instantiate, let's say, a list object that I can put in some filter criteria into a property and then say, go get that stuff. And it will load in whatever first page that I've specified. If I then go in and modify one of those entities, it can automatically save that back to the database via an API call. So again, and all this stuff can be configured however you want it, but the idea is that I can really easily grab data from the server, throw it on the screen in whatever kind of format I want, and then have the user interact with that data and have things be automatically saved and updated in a pretty dynamic fashion and not have to worry about that stuff. Now, again, you can worry about it if you want, and you can turn off some of the automatic things, but in general, it just kind of works. Tried to make that easy path pretty easy, and then if you want to do other things, that's
okay.
Totally
and so then the last thing, I guess my question would be, is that you build on the left side there with the view models and business logic. So what am I building out there?
Oh, right. Yes. That's a great question. So when you think about your database, you're going to have your POCOs and your context and all the things around that. But then the question is, well, where do I actually put my business logic? If I want, let's say, to send an email, well, how do I do that? You don't want to build up like an email object and save it in the database. You want to call a method that says, send an email and here's the to and the from and the whatever you're going to do, right? Whatever process that is. And so there's the ability to build up not only logic on your POCOs, but you can also build up logic in other parts of your application and expose that logic out to the client through APIs automatically. And so, for example, if I had some kind of method, let's say, that does send an email and it had a certain number of properties and it had a return value, I could specify for Coalesce to extend that out, build me out an API for that, build out a view model for that, and then provide all of the calls that I would need to be able to call it asynchronously. So I could call it and then get statuses back and get a callback when the thing actually returns, or all the error handling, and be able to bind little spinners on the screen to be able to know that, hey, this thing is still being called. So essentially all that stuff you'd want to be able to do to make that asynchronous call, that stuff all gets wrapped in this nice class for you that allows you to do that without a lot of fuss. And unfortunately, making an asynchronous call across between client and server, actually between almost any client and server, is difficult. I mean, there's just a lot of plumbing to do it, what I would kind of term right. You have to have a lot of things to account for all the use cases that you end up in there. So really writing your business logic, which is the core thing outside of your data model, save your data model, and then you have all the business logic that's going to work on that. And then any other view models that you have, for example, if, let's say, you don't want to project your data to the client like it is in your actual data context, you want to add essentially another layer over the top of that maybe denormalizes or obfuscates or somehow provides the data in a format that is better for your application. All that stuff can totally be done, and then the application really doesn't work on or maybe on all of your data context classes, but would work on your view models instead. And those things can really easily work back and forth and have a lot of the same features and functionality as we get out of our DTOs. So it just gives a lot of flexibility to either go directly off of your data model, things in your context, off of like essentially services that you can write out for business logic, or off of a whole new set of view models. And if you want to write new sets of view models, you can also write new sets of DTOs. And so all of the things that it builds for you, you can also go in and extend and change because, for example, inside the DTOs are all the security trimming. And so you can go in and see exactly how we're going to security trim based on user. And so you can annotate. And most of this is all done with annotations on your classes, whether those are business or whether those are your objects in your context or in your services or in your view models. You annotate them, and that then controls what gets exposed out to the client.
It does.
Does that help, Kevin?
Especially for an amateur like myself. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, whatever. Andrew, you want to talk about anything more on here?
I think what may be helpful is, I mean, we kind of talked about it for a fair amount here. Maybe helpful to
let's get into it.
Jump in and actually just start building something.
Right, let's do it.
I don't know. Some of these are actually kind of old. These are some of these are based on the Knockout stack.
Yeah, there's been a few changes to that. That's probably all the good stuff. We don't want to talk about slides.
We covered most of it anyway, so.
Yeah, that's pretty boring. Let's just get into code and write some stuff.
So if we want to go ahead and start a new project with Coalesce, the first thing that we're going to do is go out to...
You should move your taskbar to the bottom where all normal people keep it.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to be the first one to say it, Andrew.
They removed auto hide from the list here, so
it's absolutely fine.
So the first thing you want to do is come out to Coalesce on GitHub. So github.com/IntelliTect/Coalesce. This is a great place to get started. We have all the links here to not only the templates. This is also the entire repo of Coalesce itself.
Hey, and I got to put in a plug.
Andrew's
done a great job of building documentation. This is almost entirely him building all this stuff out. So all the docs you see, he gets all the props for that.
Speaking of the documentation, here's the link to the documentation. So we have coalesce.readthedocs.io. There is also a site, coalesce.intellitect.com. That's sort of a demo of a really simple demo app of the Knockout stack. It's kind of out of date at this point. We kind of need to build a new one, probably with Vue. But
yeah, maybe tonight.
Yeah, you can knock that out really quick, Andrew. I've seen you work, right?
Yeah. But this site, so this is all of the documentation for Coalesce. This includes things like getting started pages here. We have some overview pages if you want to learn about the different stacks. Vue is the one we're going to be focusing on here tonight. If you do want to go learn about the Knockout stack, have at it. So the Vue stack for Coalesce, I'll just really quickly go over this. It's better to show, not tell, but I'm going to tell you here for a minute. It is built into 4 different layers. So the first and most base layer is the metadata layer. So this is just a set of static data about your data model that is available to you at runtime on the client, so in the browser. Just things like, hey, what are all the properties of this type? What are their names? Is this one a foreign key? Okay, if it's a foreign key, what is it a foreign key to? Things like that just help us build out input controls and things like that dynamically at runtime. And so, you can use the metadata yourself in your own code. Chances are you'll never really interact with it. It's just kind of there, and it serves the other 3 layers. The next one being the model layer, which is really simple. It's just a set of interfaces that describe your data model. So these are TypeScript interfaces. They don't come with any functionality. They just basically exist as types. This also includes enums as well, are generated as TypeScript enums. The next layer up is the API clients. So this is a set of stateless classes that just wrap endpoints. So this is similar to what you might get If you were to run a Swagger generator against a Swagger document generated for your ASP.NET Core site or whatever site, it doesn't have to be ASP.NET Core. So the API client is just a set of classes with stateless methods that you can call that invoke web requests. And then the fourth and final layer is the view model layer here, and this is kind of where all the magic happens. These are the stateful objects. These provide, saves and deletes on a per object basis. These are the lists that do things like paging and searching and sorting and filtering. This is the place where you're going to be interacting with Coalesce 95% of the time when you're building an app with Coalesce and with Vue. We also have a set of components. So these are Vue components built on the Vuetify library. So those of you who frequent Kevin's stream will be familiar with material design in XAML.
That would be correct. You get extra points for getting that right.
Vuetify is similarly a material design library in Vue and JavaScript, well, in TypeScript actually. Provides a huge number of components, lots of really awesome stuff. And so what we've done is kind of built out a layer of components for Coalesce that kind of tie Vuetify into your Coalesce data model. So you can do really simple things like, hey, give me an input for this property. And then Coalesce knows, oh, that's a foreign key. So I'm going to give you a drop down that presents you with a list of all the valid objects that you can use to assign a key to this foreign key, or this is a string, so I'm going to give you a text box, or things like that. So what we want to do is get started with Vue. So this is also linked to from the homepage of the Coalesce documentation. This link down here, also over here in the sidebar, getting started with Vue. So what we're going to do is use the .NET new template that we've created, which is going to give us an out-of-the-box project with kind of all the configuration files set up for us. So this is going to have all your NPM packages are there, your kind of base set of Nougat packages that you need are there, your project structure is there.
So Andrew, what do I need to have before I get started with this?
So all you really need is the .NET SDK. Preferably 3.1, although 2.1 or 2.2 are going to work just fine for you as well. Actually, in the latest versions, 2.1 might not work, but 2.2 and 3.1 will definitely work. You're going to want Node installed, and that's going to give you your building of your Vue project. So Vue projects, at least in the way that we're using them as a SPA, you don't necessarily have to use Vue as a SPA, but that's certainly how we've designed it to be used with Coalesce. That's going to allow you to build that. That's also going to bring along NPM, so you can install your NPM packages. Failing that, you don't really need anything else, although I highly recommend Visual Studio Code with the Vetter extension installed. So that's VETUR. That's the official Vue extension. Well, it's not actually official, or maybe it's official now. I can't remember if they kind of adopted that. But that is just kind of the gold standard set of Vue tooling for Visual Studio Code. I've also had other people at IntelliTect have great success with JetBrains WebStorm for working with Vue projects. I haven't personally used it, but they seem to have had pretty good success. Visual Studio has pretty basic support for Vue projects, and specifically Vue's single file components, which we'll take a look at in a minute at what those are and what those do for you. But it's a little bit lacking. And so my personal preference, the way I usually build projects with Coalesce and with Vue, is that I use VS Code for all my front-end development, and I keep Visual Studio open for all my back-end development, just because I'm well set in my ways of using Visual Studio for all my writing C#. But you certainly don't have to use that if you like to use VS Code or you like to use something else. You open as many IDEs at once as you want. These are just how I personally prefer to do it.
Yeah, and the workflow actually works fairly well because you're building this stuff on the back end, your database stuff, your business classes and things like that. And then once you then run Coalesce and generate that middle tier, you can then basically just iterate really quickly on your front end, and you're not stopping and starting. It's just because using Webpack and all that, it just kind of works. So it's not that clunky to go back and forth between. Again, you can do it however you want.
One quick question for you, Andrew. What version, because you mentioned getting Node installed, what version of Node? Does it matter? Latest and greatest?
Latest and greatest is going to serve you well. And specifically, I'd recommend not going too old because it probably won't serve you too well. I mean, if you're within a major version or two, it is probably going to be just fine.
To decide if I need to rev my versions or not.
What I will say.
So I'm running 10.15.0.
10.15.0 or newer.
Yeah, absolutely 10 is fine. 9 is also definitely fine. What I will say is be wary. Visual Studio comes with a really old version of Node bundled with it. Be very wary of using that, or if you ever find yourself in a context where that might be getting used. For example, the Visual Studio Package Manager console will prioritize on its path the version of Node that Visual Studio comes bundled with, and you'll find yourself very quickly running into all sorts of really arcane errors, and you'll just be horribly confused at why you're getting these errors because you definitely have Node version 10 installed, except the Visual Studio is injecting its own really old.
So when in doubt, run from the command line to make sure that I'm not getting bit by extra Visual Studio stuff and check my path.
Yeah, go in. Yeah, just search for npm and options, and you can go in and find the external web tools, and then get those straight and get the Node.
Yeah, you can reorganize those in Visual Studio, so you can reprioritize them on your path.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yep, that's the key.
We'll open Coalesce there, just in the background, even though that's not actually what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be making a new project. Visual Studio doesn't want to go away.
Yeah, it wants to prepare the solution, of course.
Alrighty, so, oops, it came back. So, first step, whenever we're using a .NET new template, is make a new directory for it. I think what we're going to build here is just a really simple to-do app, because who doesn't want another to-do app?
So it's either that or a blogging app, one of the two.
Yeah.
Stokesbury isn't here, so we're not going to do a blogging app.
I got to tag him and get him on this stream too. We've got enough smart people at IntelliTect. We got to sucker him in as much as I can.
We make that bigger. That I just pressed Control+ and it just worked. Thanks Windows Terminal.
Hallelujah.
For being good.
It's about time something simple like that worked.
So now we're CD'd into our new app. So we're going to say, I guess I can zoom that to make that bigger too. We're going to make sure that we have the latest version of the template installed. So we're just going to do a .NET new install IntelliTect Coalesce View template. I might already have it installed or I might not, but just running this will just make sure.
And Andrew, should they use the full versions, or should they go for the beta versions right now?
The template doesn't have beta or full versions. The templates are all just only on Nougat.org, because otherwise, if you had to configure a special package source to install the template, it'd be really hard.
Right.
So what we do, and I probably need to address this sooner rather than later, but most of the versions of Coalesce, and even the ones that I would consider stable, are all just like 2.2.0 - some date version number. Just because I haven't gotten around to deciding when to officially release something as 2.2.0 or 3.0 probably at this point. So the templates come out of the box configured to look at the myget feed for Coalesce, which is where we publish all the CI builds. So that'll all be kind of set up for you. So you don't really have to worry about it, but it's just something to be aware of, is that the version that we'll be using isn't on Nougat.org, it's on myget on a private feed. So we'll go ahead and say a .NET new Coalesce view. And I'll say created successfully. Then we will go ahead and cd into the web project and just install our npm packages in the background here while we go and look at what that gave us. Demo. Yeah. So we get a regular old solution. Oops, I guess I can't zoom this. How about I open this in VS Code, because I can zoom VS Code.
Yay, VS Code.
But I open it over there. Zoom, zoom. So a project is just a regular old solution file with a data project and a web project. So the data project is where we're going to build all of our entity framework models, most of our business logic, kind of most of the back-end stuff that we're going to be doing is going to be in this data project up here. You'll see that we have our entity framework TB context class here. Go away, Skype. Come back, VS Code. Yes, I know the dependencies. Yes, I know. Yes, yes.
It's just trying to be so helpful.
Let's do .NET Restore in the background there too while we're at it. So we got a folder where we're going to put all of our entity framework models in here. Out of the box, we kind of put this just application user class in the template just as something, most applications have users, although if you decide you're going to go with, ASP.NET Core identity for doing your user management, you wouldn't use this class. You would use the ones that come from identity. There's some stuff that you can do. I don't know that we'll get into it tonight, but there's some stuff that you can do so you can actually manage your ASP.NET Core identity entities with Coalesce. And so you can use the Coalesce admin pages with those. You kind of have to set up an inheritance hierarchy with those classes and kind of annotate some of the properties in certain ways to secure them. You don't want to be sending the password hash field off to the client willy-nilly.
Is that covered in the docs too, Andrew? Since I know we probably won't get there tonight, is there one of the?
Okay. That isn't covered. So then
in the maybe docs. I'll have to ping you back for that later, if nothing else, for my own project.
Yeah, or we could write it into the docs, because it is a common scenario to want to do, is to bring
it is a
identity.
Right. Yeah. There's basically, you have the identity. Whether you're in the database, you have identity using Active Directory, and then you have some kind of third-party auth. Those are the kind of, the big ones.
Yeah, because if it wasn't clear, I've got my own personal project that I want to use Coalesce for, and so I'm wanting to make sure I can take full advantage of it.
I don't know how many projects we've used this for internally, but we must be up to a dozen or more. And then I know there's other people using it too. I don't know how many those are. But it's been great. I think on the average, what it saves us somewhere between 50 and 60%, 70% maybe at the best, time-wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair. So here it is open in, I guess I can zoom that part of it. Here it is open in Visual Studio. as I was saying, so what you'll get here for managing the version of Coalesce, I just want to touch on this quickly, is I use an MS build variable here called Coalesce version. The reason I do this is because the Coalesce code generation tool is a .NET CLI tool, and the Nougat package manager in Visual Studio does not support versioning of .NET CLI tool references. And so what you'll find is you'll go in and you'll try to use the Nougat package manager in Visual Studio to bump a version of Coalesce, and it'll leave this one behind, and then your versions won't match and things will be unhappy. So this is managed by a directory build props file in the solution where we define the Coalesce version. So that's, as I was mentioning earlier, that's the latest alpha version right there.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin, do you know if are they going to fix that and make tools?
I was going to ask that question.
No, they're getting rid of .NET CLI
do you know,
reference.
Andrew? Is there any open issue for that or not? I know the Nougat team is slammed with a whole bunch of stuff.
Yes.
And I don't remember seeing this on their roadmap. But if it doesn't exist, we should probably make it exist.
It is, and essentially what they've said is they're getting rid of it. .NET CLI tool reference. It's
replacing it
obsolete.
with
Nothing.
Excellent.
Nothing.
Oh, Kathleen Dollard.
.NET Global tools, which are not the same at all.
Got it. Okay, I might have to message Kathleen and then get us on a call and we'll have a chat. Because
there's a different issue somewhere around here that is specific to the issue that we have in Coalesce. I don't have a link to it, but I'm definitely subscribed to it. I'm not signed in, but I'm definitely subscribed to it. I don't think it's that one. That's old.
good to know. Because
Anyway,
the command line tools, Kathleen Dollard's the PM for the system command line project as well. So we can chat. I'm wondering, I suspect the answer may be something along the lines of, we didn't know about that use case. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, and there was something other than .NET Global Tools that come up with as well. So it looks like a tools manifest file or something, but it's not discoverable really at all. It's managed by this whole separate area of the .NET CLI, and you have to just know to run it. And it's completely outside of MS Build land, for example. So you can't do things like version it with MS Build variables. And things like
Gotcha.
that. So,
okay, cool. Sorry about the tangent. Carry forward.
No, it's great.
Okay, quick question though. Because now I have to ask.
Yep.
That Lang version latest, was that something that the template generated?
That's something in our template.
Is there a reason we went with the latest rather than coding it to an actual version?
No. No.
We can discuss later. Just something I'm noticing, only because
Great.
I avoid latest because it changes from machine to machine, right? So, but
Yeah.
carry forward. I know where the Coalesce repo is. I know how to log issues. I also know how to submit pull requests.
You know how to fix issues too. That's good. Pull requests. We love them.
Yep. And actually, this template is actually slightly behind. We've made some updates since, but they haven't been released yet. So I'll get on that sooner rather than later. This is good enough for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is go up here to my dropdown and change from IIS Express to ToDoAppWeb, because IIS Express should not be used unless you absolutely need to emulate some very specific part of IIS. It works horribly. For example, if you press stop debugging, it restarts your app. It doesn't stop your app. It stops your app and then starts it again. And so the next time you try to build or run your app, you can't build or run your app because all the DLLs are locked by IIS Express. They introduced this several years ago and have not fixed it. So anyway, so switching to this, we'll just use it with Kestrel. You can actually still technically use Windows authentication, if you set it up with HTTP sys, you don't need IIS Express even to emulate Windows authentication locally, but that's just another tangent of mine. So we're going to start the app and see what you get out of the box from the template without doing anything.
So just to repeat then, this is literally new project F5 Go.
Yes. I did go over here and I manually installed the .NET. I did a .NET restore so that this big error that you're seeing right here, you can ignore this. This is one of the things that we fixed in the template. I did a .NET restore manually to make VS Code shut up when we were looking at it, VS Code, but Visual Studio is going to do that for you. By default, Visual Studio will also do your NPM package restore. Personally, I have that turned off, but that's really more of a personal preference than anything. I just like to do that by hand whenever I'm actually changing my NPM packages. I like having that level of control over it, but you can absolutely keep the functionality in Visual Studio where it will restore your NPM packages for you. Just be aware that, again, that's a case where it uses the version of NPM that comes bundled with Visual Studio by default, which is really old and might have some issues. So this error right here saying can't find index.html, that's fixed in the latest template. Basically what happens here is when we start our Vue app, it starts up a Webpack hot module reloading dev server in the background. So that's a node process that's running side by side with our ASP.NET Core process. What happens is that the first time we hit our app, it tries to find the built output that background process is building for us, but it hasn't been built yet. So the very first time we start our app, our www root folder is empty. So we'll get this error. All you got to do is hit refresh. And once we release the newer version of the template, that won't be an issue anyway. We've made that experience better. So what you get here is just kind of a really bare bones page, including some of the stuff that this is actually, the whole project is based on VCLI, which is the standard set of Vue tooling for any kind of Vue project. It's all been standardized for a year or two, even maybe now. VCLI is out there. The Coalesce Vue template is based on having made a new project with VCLI. This kind of gives us all of our Webpack config. So Webpack does all of our bundling of JavaScript and CSS files. It does our translation from TypeScript to JavaScript. It does things like the browser compatibility, so it'll inject polyfills if we ask it to. Polyfills are what allow it to work on older browsers like IE11. If you want to go older than IE11, you should just stop and don't continue that thought any further, because that's not going to work out for you. But you can make these apps work on IE11 and Safari as well. Safari is surprisingly painful in terms of being web standards.
Question for you, Andrew. There's a question in the chat about, have you taken a look at Snowpack? I'm not familiar with it, so I'm asking you guys the question.
I have not. The name sounds like potentially a Webpack alternative. It's Kelly.
Now bear in mind, Kelly is not to be fully trusted.
I have learned. Yes, Kenny, I did gather that you were Kenny. Interesting. I've not. Maybe worth a look, but oh, I'm echoing now.
I'm trying to figure out where the echo is coming from.
Who am I? Is it gone now? Okay, it's gone now. Yeah, I mean, right now we're using VCLI just because it's kind of the standard official Vue tooling, so it's maintained by the core Vue team, so it's kind of guaranteed to be essentially zero configuration out of the box. Everything is just kind of works, and generally, and with modern web frameworks, that's when you hear that, you totally know that doesn't at all mean that it's zero configuration works out of the box. It definitely doesn't. But in this case, it actually does work pretty well. As we can see, we just got a Vue app up and running. We can even click around on these different pages. We have routing between different pages. So this is actually a custom page that's built in Coalesce, just using some incredibly bare bones stuff with that application user model.
Is that the only?
I'll get
is that
more
the only
into
entity
this.
that we have in the default template? Is just that one user? So my DB. Okay.
That is, yeah, that's correct. We can go look at the admin table for the application user entity. And actually, I may have skipped a step here, and this just worked because I do this a lot on this machine. One of the things that you need to do, and you'll actually see if we go back to this homepage here with all these kind of links. I got into mentioning VCLI because all of this is kind of the boilerplate new VCLI app. Just all these links and stuff. Obviously, you won't keep this around in your actual app, but that's what you get to start with. And then there's a little blurb down here about things that are specific to Coalesce. So just some very rudimentary next steps. So go create your data model, add your entities, all that. Then go create your entity framework migrations. So the only reason that this page is working right now is because I already have a database locally that happens to have the exact right data model that comes with the demo, and the database is named the same because I've done this before on this machine. But if you were to just do this out of the box, this example page, in fact, wouldn't work and would throw an error saying, internal server error, because your server backend is trying to make queries to tables that don't exist. So now that we've seen that we have an actual app up and running here. Oh, I'm echoing now.
That's so weird. It must be my mic. It wasn't echoing for a while. Very strange.
We can go ahead and stop the app here, and we'll go ahead and build out our entity framework data model. So what we'll want to do is go into our DB context. We'll go ahead and leave the application user's entity as it is. We won't add anything to it. We won't remove anything from it. It's dead simple. It just has an ID and a name. So since we're building a to-do app, we will add some entities. Let's say we'll add a to-do list. Go ahead and make that guy public. We will add a primary key. We will let the list have a name. And it will have a collection of items.
And just to be clear, this is just standard EF Core 3.0 stuff. Nothing fancy here, right?
Yep, or EF Core 1.0 or old school Entity Framework 6 or anything like
Cool.
that. I'm echoing again. So we'll give that a primary key. Am I echoing on stream, or is it only in my headset? Because if it's only in my headset, it doesn't.
No,
it doesn't matter.
It's echoing all the way through.
Because
It's
you're
coming
on
through the
stream.
NDI source, so I'm blaming Grant. But Grant, you do have to unmute if you want to talk. You can't just move your lips. I'm not that good.
Oh, there we go. Now it's unmuted. Oh, is it echoing now?
No.
Oh, nice. Okay, great. Leave it unmuted.
Alrighty. So, any thoughts, Grant, on anything else we want to add to our super simple
To item to list is done. Yeah, that's a great one. Who is? Can we do it in assign to?
Let's do it.
That makes for a great little drop-down list kind of thing.
So you're typing that. I'm just going to make sure I understood it. So 2 EF entity models, one to contain the list. Each list has a one-to-many relationship to a bunch of to-do items. 2 items basically have a description, a done flag, and then an assigned to person and a whole bunch of extra properties for foreign keys.
You got it.
Sweet!
You got it.
That's
Not
it.
as dumb as I look.
Just pretty basic stuff. I mean, it's just literally build your model. That's it.
Hey, I can do POCOs all day.
Now, one thing we may want to do, we'll add a little bit more flavor to this. So we'll say that this name is required, and this is just the standard system component model data annotations attribute. And we'll say that the description of the to-do item is also required. Because we're not using, we're not getting into that crazy C# nullability stuff that is, that's way beyond my pay grade.
You're underpaid then.
A point on that, though, is that I don't think anybody yet has tried to use Coalesce with nullability turned on. I honestly have no idea what will happen. I suspect that the code generation will immediately be completely broken because it will not. It will either not work or it will generate totally invalid code because it has no understanding of nullability and what things are nullable.
Yeah, nullability across interfaces that can be easily null, like the web. There's some. It adds a lot of overhead, and yeah, I'm not sold on it yet. I totally get the advantages, but some of the amount of code, whenever it obfuscates your code to add it, I have problem with it.
The other thing too, you turn nullability on, and EF will do different things, right? So EF uses the presence of the nullability flag to determine the nullability of columns in your database. So you turn it on, and your EF migrations are going to change, just for reasons.
Right. It's probably something we should try, though.
I like doing it, and I keep slowly converting libraries to it, and we'll probably live stream it again. I did some live streaming on turning nullability on for the system command line project, and that was, we'll say, an adventure.
So here, the only thing that is different is that little Coalesce attribute up at the top. Andrew, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so what the Coalesce attribute does is literally just an attribute called Coalesce attribute. So you can just have it like that, and it looks nice and neat. Is kind of the attribute that we use in all the places where we want to say, hey, when we do our code generation or when we're running actually at runtime, this is the thing that we want to expose with Coalesce. So by default, Coalesce will not pick up anything out of your data model. And in fact, we can try this. So let's go ahead and run the Coalesce code generation here. So we're going to be inside our web project, and we're just going to say .NET Coalesce. And what this is going to do is go examine our data in web project, which it knew to pick up based on the values in this coalesce.json file that's in our solution. That comes out of the box with the template pre-configured to point at the right projects. But if you wanted to move your projects, change around your folder structure, something like that.
You got to save your files first.
No, I did this on purpose. Oh, no, yes. I did it on purpose, but not on purpose enough.
Exactly. You didn't save them on purpose.
And just to be clear, this has to be run from inside of the web project, not the data project.
Right, so run your migrations from the data project and run the Coalesce generation from the web project. So your migrations will end up in your data project, and your web stuff will end up in your web project. So it kind of makes sense for you to run that.
Yeah, and technically, you don't have to do this from your web project. The only reason why you do is because we put the .NET CLI tool reference in the CS proj of the web project. So this is what lets .NET recognize .NET Coalesce as a valid command. Is this .NET CLI tool reference in there? This could very well be in the data project instead, or it could be in both projects, actually. There's nothing preventing you from doing that, and then you could actually run that in all your projects.
Yeah, just talk briefly about Coalesce JSON.
Yeah, so Coalesce JSON, here it's in your solution items by default, and in fact, on the newer versions of the template, we also include the directory build props file, which is also another one that's super useful to have in there, to have access to as a solution level file. But the Coalesce JSON file just has sections for your web project and your data project. So the web project is the project where the generated output is going to be put into. The data project is the project that Coalesce is going to look at to determine what to generate. So because there's kind of a chicken and egg problem, we can't, for example, generate based off of the contents of the web project, because your web project may be in an uncompilable state because the generated code doesn't match what's in your data project anymore. So there kind of has to be this clear separation of generated output goes in the web project, input for the generation comes out of the data project, and never shall those lines be crossed.
Got it. And so the generated stuff, if I can go back and remember the graphic from the beginning, is going to be all of my controllers, all of my TypeScript and generated views, right? So, yeah.
Right.
So all of those gray boxes there is everything that ends up getting dumped into my web project for me.
Yep.
And just one quick comment too from Cameron. Apparently, one of the projects he was on, they turned on nullability. He said they didn't go through all of the cases, but it, and I will put this in quotes, seemed feasible. So I heard that as a volunteer to do a pull request to turn on nullability.
Yeah, thanks. That's really great. That's really just kind of the spirit of the people that we like to have at IntelliTect is people like Cameron who just put themselves out there and say, hey, I'll go do that horrible thing that nobody wants to do.
Thank you, Cameron.
Yeah, so the other thing in here that we have is we're saying root generator is view. So the two options here are knockout and view. Knockout is actually the default, just for backwards compatibility's sake. But in this case, because we use the view template, we're just saying, hey, go generate view stuff. Don't go generate knockout stuff because this isn't a knockout project. And then here, this is configured. I should probably make this the default at this point, but this is just saying I want the scripts section, all of the scripts generators, which are all my front-end scripts, I want to change those to a different folder. This whole file is documented on the documentation out here as well. So my sidebar isn't collapsed. So down here at the very, very, very bottom, in this code generation configuration page is the documentation with the Coalesce JSON file. So we have our to-do list and our to-do items, and we ran the code gen, but we had commented out the Coalesce attribute. And so we'll find Coalesce is actually going to complain about us because it didn't find anything that we wanted to expose. So the way we do that is to keep this attribute there, to not comment it out. But that just kind of generates, so DB contexts are something that Coalesce can expose. You can expose regular old classes as services if you also include the service attribute. So if we said Coalesce and service, so this is also an attribute in the Coalesce namespace that said this is a service class that we want to expose via a web API.
So just to be clear, that service attribute basically sets it up to say, here's another source of things that I want to generate controllers and whatnot for, right? Is that a fair way of phrasing it.
Yeah, and so the reason why you might make a service is because you have some set of functionality that you want to have on your front end that doesn't really pertain to a specific entity framework entity, or it doesn't really belong as methods on the entity. Because what we can also do is, we can add a method saying, public void because it doesn't need to return anything, mark complete. We can say is done, is true. It can actually be just that simple. And all we have to do to expose this with Coalesce is just, once again, annotate it with the Coalesce attribute. And that will then generate out things on the front end. It'll generate out an API endpoint, make that really easy to call. Once we get to kind of writing the front end code, we'll see how.
So that was part of the
doing that. And these methods,
so that was part of the comment earlier about the TypeScript stuff that it generates are a little bit smarter than just like straight up Swagger type client gen, right? Is you get all of this magical stuff built into it.
Yep. Yeah, and so it knows when you call this endpoint, you're actually calling this on an instance of your ToDoItem class on the front end. And it knows, oh, okay, this is an instance method on my ToDoItem, so I need to send along my my primary key. And then the controller knows, okay, I need to go pull that object out of the database using this primary key that I received, and then go call that method on that object. So it's very intimately aware that it's operating in a relational data model, and it knows kind of what you need to do back and forth between the client and the server in that context.
Yeah, and there are things like dependency injection and things like that. And we can get into that a little bit. Like, let's say you wanted to write a static method that would iterate over everything in your database or all that type of object and do something maybe a little larger in scale.
So right here, we actually see, so even ignoring the fact that I didn't have the attribute and now I do, we actually have a different error, which I wasn't planning on having happen, but it's a great learning experience. Is that when we try to rerun the generation, we see ToDoApp.data.models.ToDoItem.list, so the property list on class ToDoItem, has no ID property found for the related object. And so the way we fix that, and it even suggests to us the fix here, is that the related object needs to specify the foreign key that either matches by name or is marked with the foreign key attribute.
So this is Coalesce error checking, right? This isn't some magical shelling out somewhere else?
Yes, this is
Nice.
Coalesce.
So it's somewhat helping me not be stupid
Coalesce,
with EF.
Yeah. So Coalesce can kind of only discover things about your data model either via annotations or just via conventions, so just naming things in the right way. And also just by the presence of your properties here. What it can't do, at least not at the moment, I've kind of toyed around with this idea but didn't take it very far. What it can't do is determine anything that you may have set up in terms of relationships in your on-model creating method. Fortunately, there's not really anything that Coalesce does that you can't configure with annotations. And there's not really anything that we found that we need to do that you can't configure with annotations, but just know that, if you do stuff and you configure a relationship and you exclusively configure it in your on-model creating an entity framework, that Coalesce can't know what you put in there. It doesn't run this method to determine what kind of fluent configuration you set up in here. And so if we, related this this ID to this list, and you'll see right here why Coalesce couldn't pick this up, is because I called its foreign key to-do list ID, but I called its navigation property just list. So there's not a complete association there. There should have been to-do list and to-do list ID, and then it knows just by convention, navigation property, and then the foreign key is the navigation property plus ID. So Coalesce can now pick that up just fine. The other thing I could have done, if I for some reason wanted to keep that, is just say foreign key name of to-do list ID. Import that from system component model. And that's it. So that's understood. That's an annotation that's understood both by Entity Framework and by Coalesce. So that not only configures your Entity Framework model to make sure everything is matched up right, but it also configures Coalesce.
So just a little bit of. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
For now, though, I'll do it like that without the annotation.
So Andrew, you did mention kind of what happens behind the scenes a little bit. And when you run that Coalesce, we're actually going in and using the Roslyn compiler to compile the data, and then, or to compile the code, and then actually go through all the symbols. It's not necessarily done at runtime using reflection. There's a part of this that does work on reflection, but all the code gen works off of the compiler and the symbols that the compiler creates. Which that's a whole nother talk we could do trying to get that thing to work.
Oh, yeah. So now we'll see everything that it just made for us. So we'll see on these four, we'll see regenerated because we came with the template out of the box, kind of the core files. So these correspond one-to-one with the 4 layers of the view stack that I talked about earlier. No, in no particular order, because they'll generate in parallel, so they'll just come out in whatever random order. But we have the API clients, so those are our static, not static, but stateless clients, which represent our API methods, and we can actually go and look at these as we talk through them, just to get a better idea of what. Oh no, I just opened Edge. Oh.
It's okay. It's now Chromium based. It's not quite as yucky.
Yeah, that might actually work.
Inside our SRC, we have start the metadata first. Just go to maximize that. This font looks kind of wonky when it's zoomed in. So we'll see we have a whole bunch of imports up here, and you can just kind of ignore that. That's just all of the types that kind of make this metadata work under the hood. So we'll see we're exporting a const here, which is just an object. This object in particular represents our application user class. It just kind of has all sorts of things on it. This is just the name, so this is the actual name of the class. This is a human readable version of the name of the class. This tells us, hey, if I want to display an application user and you didn't otherwise tell me how to display one, this is what property you should render. So you should render the name. And that gets picked up by convention. So by default, if you have a property called name, Coalesce will use that if you just try to render an object raw without trying to actually pick a specific property you want to display. Has some other stuff here, hey, here's the primary key. This is a flags enum that you can't tell what the flags are, but this tells us whether you can create or edit or delete the thing. This is all the different properties. You can say, hey, the application user ID, this one is the primary key, whereas the name is just a regular old value. It doesn't kind of have any relational meaning. And then that just kind of continues on down here for all the other types. You'll see, for example, here's a foreign key, so it has all sorts of fun stuff on it. Here's the principal key that this foreign key points to. So it points to on the type to-do list. It points at to-do list ID. The principal type is to-do list. So to-do list ID references a to-do list. To-do list ID is a foreign key, and it also happens to have a navigation property called to-do list. In this case, that's the to-do list on the to-do item, which corresponds to this property right here, and so on and so forth. So again, this is a navigation property, so it kind of is the same things. Kind of just keep going with that. But in general, you'll never have to look at the metadata file or even really think about it. It's just kind of there. You can always access this information. You're free to import this into your own code if you want to do some kind of crazy dynamic thing on your front end at runtime. It's totally there for you. But for the most part, this just kind of drives all the rest of it.
And you change it through attributes that you put on your model. So there's a big list of all the attributes that you can do in the documentation. You can go through and look at all those. So if you want to say, hey, this is the property to display or make another property, you could use a property that was just dynamically calculated for your display name. Like let's say you wanted to have the name and maybe the birth date. You can put that together really easily.
And just to be clear, when we say it affects it, this is all the way down to the view generation of like what type of field is it going to generate for me when it exposes this property on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have some control over that for sure. Like if we show you a date, you want to see the date or a date and a time, those kinds of things. Just as the default. Again, you can override this stuff and build all your own, but we wanted to make it kind of give you that 90% solution out of the box, and then the last 10%, while it isn't super easy, it's pretty easy to go ahead and then just write your own thing.
Yep. So next thing up is the models layer. So as I mentioned earlier, these are just basically just a set of interfaces that describe your model. They also have a property on them called $sign metadata. So that comes from this base class model here. So this points at the corresponding metadata object for that type. So an application user model is going to have a $sign metadata property that points at the metadata for application user. And then it's just going to have all the properties that were on your entity that you've decided to expose to the client. By default, all of your public properties on your entities are exposed to the client. If you want to hide a property from Coalesce and make Coalesce never think about it or consider it or change it in any way, you can either just mark it anything less than public, or you can use this internal use attribute, which comes from Coalesce. This is just a way, instead of using the actual C# internal modifier, this lets you keep it public if you actually need it to be public for purposes of your backend, but still hide it entirely from Coalesce.
And hide in this case really just means ignored from any sort of generation.
Ignored from generation, never sent to the client in any way, never updated by any of the endpoints that Coalesce exposes. It basically says, hey, Coalesce, pretend this doesn't exist.
Gotcha.
Yeah, with the one exception, if you write a method that changes that property, it will change. It just takes it out of the kind of object models that we hand back.
Right, and in that case, it is still hidden from Coalesce because Coalesce doesn't know what you're doing in your method bodies.
Yep.
At that point, that's just your own code.
It's your own code. Yep.
Wrong window. These also export a class which isn't ever actually really used as a class. They just used to export some static methods. Say, hey, given something that might vaguely resemble an application user, convert this into an actual application user model. So it just makes sure that all these properties are initialized, for example. Next layer up is the API clients. So again, these are the stateless methods for calling the API endpoints. So all these do, you could treat these classes like singletons if you want. They don't have any state of their own. Their constructor is parameterless. Having them as classes is a really boon for unit testing, because then you can instantiate a specific API client and pass that, for example, inject that into a view model and then mock out some of your methods on the API client so that in your unit tests, you're not actually trying to call the server, you just mock out this particular API endpoint. So here we see the one special API method that we made called markComplete. That just does a little bit of boilerplate here to map the incoming parameters. In this case, all it takes is an ID. That ID is the primary key of the to-do item that we're operating on, and then calls the method back on the server.
So how did it know to take an ID? Is it just because it's on a database entity, so it knows in order to get that entity, it needs the PK, primary key for it?
Yep, exactly. So it's an instance method on an EF entity.
If it were
so that it knows that in order to figure out what instance to call it on, we got to tell it a key.
And if it were a static method, it wouldn't.
If you made a static there, it would not have that.
Ah.
Yep. So we can do static. It could also be on a service class if we wanted to do that.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That's pretty cool.
In either case, there.
Yeah, and when you do a static, you almost always need to dependency inject your database context or something like that, because otherwise you can't really do anything that's meaningful.
So Do those?
You want to throw one of those on there, Andrew?
Yeah, so the things that we can dependency inject, we kind of get a couple for free. If you just put the type of your DB context, so app DB context, and in fact, it doesn't have to be a DB context that owns this type. It can actually be anything that derives from DB context, and it will just inject that from your service container. It can be claims principal, which will then inject the current user from the HTTP context in which the method gets called. And then you can inject anything else from your container if you just mark it with the inject attribute. So we could, add an HTTP context accessor.
So from the container means the ASP.NET Core default DI container, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
So we can get the current HTTP context and say, hey, what's the IP address of the remote machine, for example.
And we could have made a static method in this case that hands that back. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense on the to-do list item, but if you wanted a method that did that, that's super easy to write. I mean, just throw the static method on there, inject the piece you need, and return the data that you want.
Right, or maybe you want the IP address for some sort of audit logging or something. You want to record what IP address they called from when they marked the item done, or whatever. But the idea here is that you can inject anything from the service container that has been registered in startup, including all the things that you get from ASP.NET Core for free.
Got it. So anything from the container marked with the inject attribute or DB context class or claims principal.
Yep.
Right.
And you can find all of these inside the methods page in the documentation. We can see a list of all the different types of parameters that these accept. So any primitive like values, so numbers, strings, bools, enums, date kinds, so the two native date types in C#. Those are all allowed. You can pass entire objects. Those can be entities or anything else, just whatever you put there. Just be aware that if you put some type that you don't own, like some CLR type or something, Coalesce will generate DTOs based off that CLR type and recursively for any properties that CLR type owns. That can explode badly if you pick the wrong type. So the recommendation here is don't pick types that you didn't create yourself.
But it will give you a nice little client-side object that you can fill out and then hand back.
Yep. You can have file parameters. So if you want to do a file upload, it'll actually do this as kind of a proper file upload, and it'll give you a browse for file thing. You can pick the file, and then when you call the method, it'll actually upload the file. And then again, anything that inherits from DB context, you can inject the claims principal. Anything annotated with inject, which will be injected from your service provider. And then it include tree, which I won't even try to get into tonight.
Which is a very interesting conversation around how do you trim the objects that you're handing back and how do you use EF and includes and stuff like that. So that's a whole other discussion for another day, Kevin.
Oh, I don't doubt it.
Right. How do you serialize a circular object graph into a serialization format that doesn't support reference preserving and doesn't otherwise really understand circular object references, i.e. JSON?
Yeah, and how do you trim when EF gets overzealous and you've brought back objects that are just decides to start attaching to your tree that you may not want to hand to the client because it's just extra cruft?
Yeah. Granted, there are forms of JSON that do support references, but not anything that is natively supported by browsers, for example. So it requires us to pull in some additional library to kind of handle that, which wasn't a step that we were wanting to take. I'll go ahead and remove that HTTP context accessor, but yeah, now you have the DB and the user, and these can be async. So we'll do async void like that.
Async void or async task?
No, async void I think is really good. Just trying to make you squirm there.
My Twitch factor went way up.
You know, return whatever you want, or you know, just regular task and don't return anything. That's fine too. We can also do task of item result. And what item result is a special type in Coalesce that lets us signal success or failure, and then also provide a specific failure message that will propagate up to the front end user. So we can say, if is done, item is already done. So this has some implicit operators on it that convert from string, and if you give it a string, it's an error message. If you give it a Boolean, it's just a straight success or failure. Generally, you should probably not just return false, because that means you're just saying it didn't work, but you're not giving any reason why it didn't work.
That is both awesome and terrifying all at the same time. I love it.
Yeah, nothing async.
Yeah, no, it's all upset that
No
I'm
wait.
not.
Well, it's flagged async with no wait in it.
context.
When in doubt, wait for a millisecond. Yeah, so API clients that gets generated, this method here. View models, this is where all the magic happens. It's not really worth looking at what actually gets generated here. Yeah, I mean, you can do that on your own time. It's pretty similar, other than that, you know, pretty similar to the models. The exception being is that we define all the properties for anything that was an object type. We redefine that as the view model version of that object rather than the model. And then you'll see here when we have, you know, custom stuff, special stuff, we'll also see things like this. So this is kind of our interface in our view model for interacting with this mark complete method. Excuse me, I need some water here.
Water. Is that the stuff that they put in Mountain Dew to make it taste good?
I think that's what they do, so you can drink it rather than eat it with a fork.
That sounds amazing.
So yeah, so I think at this point, let's actually build a page here, so we can actually start using some of this fun stuff.
Well, you should run it and just show them the admin screens, just so they can see that it works.
Now that we've done all of that work and generated all those views.
Oh yes. We did. We actually, I need to regenerate because we changed the signature of this. So you'll see here, you know, in our controller, this is not going to work because we're missing those two parameters. So we'll go ahead and regenerate that. The other thing that we need to do is remember my Windows terminal keybinds. Oh, they zoom independently. Ooh, that's interesting. CD there, CD into our data project, and add a migration, because we just added 2 new tables that Entity Framework doesn't yet know how to create those in SQL Server. In this case, it's SQL Server local DB is what it's set up to use by default, since you get it for free with Visual Studio. If you're writing C#, you probably have Visual Studio. You're always welcome to change that if you don't want to do that to something like SQLite or whatever your preferred Entity Framework provider is. Migrations add.
I normally just configure mine for Oracle.
Good luck with that. We did just do a project with MySQL, though. Worked out great. No changes.
Alrighty, so now we got our migration. We can go ahead and I'll just actually just run this in here. Because why not? Let's run it on the command line. Just start up. Okay, now listening. Go ahead and give that a refresh. Your first startup after launching the process will be just a little bit slow as it kind of does that initial build of all your JavaScript. But then after that, it does incremental builds. So it's only rebuilding the stuff that you've changed. So we can go ahead and look at one of the admin tables. So we can say /admin, and I'll tell you how we know what this route is that inside of our project, inside router.ts, this is where we define the view router, which just defines all of the pages and the URL slugs where those pages can be found. You'll see we have a home page, there's an about page, there's this Coalesce example page that we looked at earlier. And then here's our Coalesce admin routes. So these components here that these route to came from that Coalesce Viewtify library that I was mentioning earlier. So this is a component that provides a complete admin page with all of the features that you're about to see. But the path here is /admin and then / the name of the type. So in this case, we want to-do list. It didn't work. I suspect what happened here.
Well, that error message has lists, plural.
Yes. That's actually what it's supposed to be. So that comes off of, the table name comes off the name of your DB set. So in this case, it is to-do lists.
Got it. So not the name of the type, but the name of the property on the DB context.
Yep. So in this case, the migration appears to have not run. And the only reason I can think that might have happened is, yeah, because of this. This is using a different database that is probably polluted with a bunch of other migrations, and Entity Framework got confused. That should be getting replaced in the template, and it's not. I'll have to look at that. So, oops. So in our app settings, so we have two places where this happens. One is in our app settings.json. So this is kind of the main place that our connection string comes from. ToDoAppDB. So we'll just change this to some other name. Doesn't matter what we pick. It should just match this one. So this development app DB context factory is the one that the EF command line tooling will use when generating your migrations. So it uses this to diff your database against your code and say, okay, what things do I need to put in this migration? What things are different versus the actual database? And it can't. It can, I say it can't, but it actually can use your startup.cs, and the EF command line tooling will actually run your ASP.NET Core startup CS and look at like your configuration here, and it will execute this method and then pull the database configuration back out of there. But there's cases where that doesn't work. Notably, if you're running the EF command line tooling from your data project instead of your web project, which is usually what you want to do. They kind of did this for this kind of weird scenario that they advertised for a while, and kind of like they're all getting started with ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework. Put your web project and your data and your DB context and put everything in one project, which is great. I guess it's a kind of basic intro, but it doesn't scale well. So, and also doesn't work at all with Coalesce because they have to be in separate projects. So anyway, change our database name, save all the files, go ahead and stop the app, start it back up. When it starts back up, it will try to rerun the migrations. It'll find that the database doesn't exist, so it'll create it automatically, and then we'll be good to go. So this right here is the reason why that Coalesce example page was working for me earlier, is because I already had some other database on my machine that happened to have a table with the same name.
Is there any chance that your DB migrations might be a little dorked if it was diffing it against the wrong database?
Yes.
Excellent.
Actually, yes. I think they actually were. No, they weren't. It may have been diffing it against the app DB context model snapshot, which is the other thing that it uses to diff your database. I don't entirely understand which thing it uses in which case, but
Got it.
it does. Okay, so now we have a admin page for a to-do list. So we got all kinds of things. We have pagination, we have filtering, we have searching, we have creating, we have lists that are empty because we didn't create something, so we can make something.
Work items.
Work items. And you can see it was saving as we type. So you saw some activity over here in our actual web application running here in the process, but we can also as we type, it's actively saving what we type. So all the admin pages have autosave automatically. So we can go ahead and add some items. And you'll see when we click this link here, so we're on a specific to-do list called work items. When we click this none link, this actually brings us to a to-do item list that is filtered to that specific list. So it's pre-populated with this filter. So we're filtering to-do items belonging to the work items to-do list. And when we say create, because we're filtered by that, Coalesce actually knows to pre-fill the to-do list as work items.
Accept my PR.
Fix the Coalesce view template.
Or just accept the PR that's open for it.
Ah. We need to assign this to somebody, but our database is empty of users. Unfortunately, there's not a magical way to just create a user right here. So I'll just open a new tab. That is something that you can do on custom pages, but it's not something the admin pages do out of the box because we don't really know how to just magically create a user based on what you type in.
Still, that's pretty kind of cool.
So we'll go to the admin user, the user admin page, and we'll make a new user, and this will, of course, be Cameron. So we can search now. Now we have it assigned to Cameron, and now it's because we filled out all our required fields, it now saved, and now it popped up this actions list of the method that we had added to the to-do item, and we can say mark complete. So we can expand this little guy here. If you had multiple methods, you would see those all here. We can say execute, and it's done. You see result is null. That's actually been fixed. It should just say success because it didn't have anything specific to say about it.
That is cool.
If we hit this again, we get an error because the item is already done. And that came, of course, from the code that we wrote over here to say that the item is already done.
So kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, it's being able to say and put the logic in for what do I do if I run this too many times, but doing all the plumbing to get in between those two pieces is a lot of work. And so that's kind of all the stuff that Coalesce does for you and just lets you do the parts that you care about.
That's pretty slick. Now, so these are all generated pages, so obviously I don't want to go in and necessarily muck with the code in here because I'm guessing next time the generator runs, it blows this stuff away, right? But I can...
Yeah, and these aren't in the knockout stack, these would be kind of generated, and you'd have these pretty big CSHTML files that have all these, you'd see the input field for description and is done and to-do list and assigned to and so on. In the view stack, these are all kind of dynamically created at runtime based off of the metadata. And so there's not actually a file that was generated that gives us this page. It's just a component which is driven off of the metadata. So it says, okay, I'm an admin page. Okay, for example, an admin list. I'll start there. An admin list is comprised of this toolbar up here, which itself is comprised of, this pagination control and this filter dropdown and this, showing 1 through 1 of 1, this textual representation of pagination, and of course this list here. But those are all components that exist in the Viewify components for Coalesce, which I seem to have lost here. We go down into the documentation to the Viewify components. So the page that we're looking here right now for this list is, let me zoom that back in, is the cAdmin table page. And if we go and look at the documentation for this, we'll see, hey, normally you use it by passing it to a view router. You just route directly to it. You don't typically embed it within some custom page, although you certainly could. That's a totally valid thing to do, but it's designed to have UI elements that allow it to serve as a standalone page. But this particular component is built off of a cAdmin table and a cAdmin methods component. So the cAdmin methods component is the one that we saw here with these actions and then each method on thing. So when that's used on the list, it shows the static methods. When that's used on an instance, it shows the instance methods.
These are very similar to what I would call like a WPF data template. And so you can take those individual ones and say, hey, I only want this top grid embedded inside of my page, and drop that component in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's do that right now because it's super easy. So we will go and we'll just take this existing view that we have, this Coalesce example page. This just kind of has a bunch of stuff on it. Honestly, I don't really want to keep any of this. I'm just going to blow away pretty much all of it, just to kind of get things simplified down here. We'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. So all that we're going to keep here is our class here. So this defines all of the scripts for our component. What we're going to do is we're going to add a cAdmin table. Let me reference the documentation because I don't normally use these standalone. So cAdmin table takes a property called model, which is expected to be a list view model. So we will say model is a to-do item list. I have cats walking on my keyboard.
They're just trying to pair
and
program.
To-do item list, we'll just stick on our component down here as a new to-do item, and we'll see IntelliTect's jumps into action, says, hey, here's all your to-do item stuff that was generated for you. So in this case, we want to-do item list view model. Go ahead and save that. And that's it. So we can now go to Coalesce example. Now, that didn't work, and I'll tell you why it didn't work. The admin page component, because it's designed to be standalone, does things like automatically loads the list for you. I might be saying totally the wrong thing, so hang on, let me double check that that's not what happened. View model. Oh, did I document that wrong? I absolutely wrote the wrong name in the documentation. The prop is not called model. The prop is called list, and that doesn't even match. Oops. Hey, Cameron, you still here? You want to log a bug for me? Or somebody else? He's still here. Want to log a bug for me? So this, not called model, it's called list.
Grant looks like he's all over that.
I am.
There we go.
There now.
So now we have just the list part, complete with contents, pagination, all that kind of stuff. And we could kind of keep drilling into these. So, cAdmin table itself is a cAdmin table toolbar and a ctable and clist pagination. So clist pagination is
the guy in the top right, I assume.
No, that's actually part of the toolbar. That might be wrong as well. I thought there was pagination. Oh, you know what? I said the template is a little bit out of date. The template is a little bit out of date. And I think that has been added. So it's just pagination information at the very bottom. But this is a great chance to say, hey, how do I upgrade this thing? Because it's not just Nougat packages, it's NPM packages and all that. So I just went to the documentation page, which I know happens to have a link to Coalesce View on NPM. But you could just go to go to NPM and search for Coalesce View. Just because I don't know off the top of my head exactly what this version number is, which is the latest version. And don't look at latest. That's not actually the latest. Dev is the latest. Latest in this case in NPM world means like the latest release version, typically. So we'll go over here and find our package.json file. And we'll find our two Coalesce packages. So there's Coalesce View and Coalesce View Viewify. Oops, get out of here, white space. And we will rev both of those, and we want to keep those on the same version. If they get out of sync, they might just have little compatibility issues with each other. So we can save that. And then we will cd into our web project. Or if you have the Visual Studio automatic NPM package restore enabled, you can let that do its thing too. Nope, that's not the right thing. It's not .NET. This is an NPM package. So we'll do an NPM install, or NPM I for short. Actually, I should have. If you don't stop your app before doing this, sometimes it can explode because you're trying to update files out from underneath the node process that's running your Vue app in the background.
When you say it may explode, do you mean your NPM install will explode or the app will explode?
Well, kind of both. They'll start fighting with each other quite violently over who gets to own which files, which will slow the whole thing way down, and also probably just cause one or the other to just start failing because a file was ripped out from underneath it, or it couldn't get a lock on a file that it was trying to change, or something like that. So just a pro tip there. Stop your app before changing your NPM packages. Otherwise, it gets unhappy.
I get unhappy too when people yank
now
my
that we've updated
stuff out
that,
from under me.
we can reload, and I think we will now see pagination at the bottom of this list. Again, once that first build finishes. There it is. So this is why the documentation said there's list pagination at the bottom, because there is. So just additional controls. If you had a very tall list, you want to be able to hit next page after you scroll down to the bottom of the list, not have to scroll all the way to the top and then hit next page. So we added that.
Cool. And I assume that page size and everything is configurable in there too?
Yeah, so we could add, I mean, because this is just a custom page, we could start adding, we could either use, something that's like an out-of-the-box Viewtify thing, like vContainer, is kind of a page level component that constrains the width of your page and adds some borders and margins to kind of make it look nice like this. Or you can just, start adding just regular old CSS margins and whatnot if you want to do that too. The other notion of page size, which I now realize you meant, is like this page size. Yes, you can do that too. So maybe on mounted, we want to say to do item list dot this dot to do item list dot page size. And so we'll see on our list view model, we have all of these different properties. So all of the kind of out of the box Coalesce ones that aren't specifically having to do with your properties and your method names that you've created on your data model are all prefixed with $. That just avoids name conflicts. Also just kind of offers the things like, hey, these are kind of all the standard ones that are going to be there on everything. So, we have, page size equals 25. And now we see our page size is 25.
Cool.
Actually, let me put that over here so we can really see the hot module reloading in practice. So if I say the 100, save the file, and then boom.
Nice. You're making it look easy.
We can add the lists, we could say so some of these are in here inside the parameters object. So we could say that's not a very good one. Filter to ones where is done is true. That'll give us a filter by default, which now we see on the admin page is configured up here. That's wrong, but Is that an artifact of hot module reloading? No. Maybe that's broken. I mean, it was filtering to true, but it's like the toggle there defaulted to false. But if we turn that back to false, back to actually false, then we see the one item that we had that was done is now gone because we said we want the ones where it's done is false.
So, fun chicken and the egg with filtering, if I'm understanding.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know why that's broken, but I think I heard typing there in the background. Somebody logging a GitHub issue, maybe.
So, your is done on that filter. I assume that control that it was showing there, where it has the on, off, and then the null, that would be if the property was actually nullable? Or is null just don't send it over the wire type deal in that case?
Nope, yep, you're exactly right. So that's filtering where the actual property has a value of null.
Got it.
In this case, actually none of our properties here are nullable because we made them required, I think.
Well, and is done, I believe we made it into a...
that's a Boolean, that's required, yeah, so none of these could actually be null. But assuming that it could be null, that would say, give me the ones where the value is actually null.
Gotcha. Cool.
And we could add, a filter for descriptions. We could say fix the star. Then it'll give us all the ones that starts with fix the.
Hey, show the searching a little bit too, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and actually the searching, let me remove that. The searching is actually not going to work right now because we haven't configured any properties to search. So if I say fix, I now get no results. So the way we want to set that up to work is over here in our C# data model. We're going to go ahead and just annotate this with search. There are some properties that can be searched by default. If you have again, similar to the display text, if you have a property called name, that will be searchable by default. Also, the primary key will be searchable by default. So if we actually just say 1, it actually comes up with that result because this happens to be the item with primary key 1. That applies if you don't have any properties marked as searchable. If you do have any properties marked as searchable, then it will use the ones that you marked instead and won't use those defaults. So if we want the description to be searchable, we can annotate it with search, and we have a couple different options here. One of these, this first one here, is split on spaces. So this will split your search term into each word that you entered, split by space character. And then it will search across all your searchable properties with each word that was in your search term.
So if you had two strings, you could find those words in two different strings if you put down two words with a space in between.
Mm-hmm. So we can actually do that. So we'll actually put the search property on a navigation property, and we'll see what that does. So we'll say is split on spaces is true, and then we can say, in this case, I don't want to do the search method, but in this case, we can say is split on spaces true, and we can say search method is, and we can either pick a begins with search or a contains search. Now, just to note that, when you're going against a database, a begins with search can use an index to speed it up. A contains search cannot use an index.
Except if it's a full text.
Yes, which neither of these do a full text search. We haven't added that option, but we could if somebody wanted to do it. It's just usually, and I actually just did this recently on one of our clients' projects, is I added a full text search, and it's not just as simple as like adding an attribute on something. If you want a really good full text search that kind of gives you really high fidelity results, you have to do a lot of fine tuning and writing of raw SQL queries to get that to work right. There's a surprising amount of work involved to make that a really nice experience, I found. So, but we'll do a contains on that, and I will use. So when we say search on application user, we'll actually get the name property by default, although we'll just go ahead and be explicit here anyway. Search using split on spaces, and then the default is it starts with, and we'll just leave that as the default here. Now, using my intimate knowledge of how Coalesce works, I know that the search attribute does not require a code gen because it doesn't affect the generated code in any way. It's only ever gets picked up at runtime. So I don't need to do a .NET Coalesce here. I can just restart the app. So it picks up the C# changes that I made.
So in general, when do I need to know to run the .NET Coalesce?
Anytime you add or remove properties, anytime you change method signatures, or kind of anytime you're adding and removing kind of things that you work with on the front end. So obviously if you add a new property and you want to use it on the front end, you have to regenerate so it's in your TypeScript now.
There's only a few things, like there's that particular attribute where the search method in the API actually uses reflection to figure out what fields to search rather than having that code generated in. So there's some balancing between what stuff do you actually generate code for and what stuff do you just use reflection at runtime. So the searching is reflection at runtime. Most of the other stuff is not. It's actually code gen.
Yeah, I'd say most times when you make changes to your data model, you just need to run the code gen.
Yeah.
Search really is kind of one of those edge cases where you don't, but most other things you do. So we can go ahead and search here, and we can say fix. And actually, let's add some more things so we can have more interesting search results. Break the code. I guess everything's going to be assigned to Cameron because we only have one person.
How handy is that?
Filter
right. I'm filtered still.
Yeah.
Because I put that in the code. So it's... I removed it, but I never saved the file. So now when we type fix, we just get that one. Or if we say Cameron Camerons, we don't get anything, but Cameron, we do. We say Cameron fix, which is a nice complete sentence that I find myself saying often. Sorry, Cameron, we're picking on you all night. Usually it's in relation to crappy old code that I wrote.
Early. And it's super handy when you're looking for objects because it will actually traverse down multiple layers of your object model to find things. And it just kind of magically works by annotating stuff with Coalesce.
That is pretty awesome, though, because just thinking about the amount of code that I would have to write to go through and implement that, going all the way from my front-end object all the way to the back and querying the database and pulling that back. And did I understand correctly? Was that going as you were typing? Like, is there some sort of timer?
Yeah. So that's. Yeah. So there is. It does do it automatically as you type, and it's debounce, so it doesn't. I mean, because it's still running on localhost, it completes in single-digit milliseconds. That's 2 digits, but it's almost a single digit. But if we introduce some latency into the thing here, then we delete that, then we can see hey, there's a progress bar there while it's searching, and we can say fix the template and other words that aren't matched. Then we can see that it basically searches sort of as fast as the network allows, and as fast as the server allows.
Can I search specific fields in there, Andrew?
You can. So I mean, say if you wanted to search, is done for false. Then that wouldn't work because we don't support Booleans, and I picked a terrible example of that. But if we search,
there's not much left.
If we added search attributes to the other two things. Oh, let me reduce my network throttling. There, that one works. So I specifically said, even though to-do list wasn't marked as searchable by default as a kind of free-form text search, I can still say, hey, specifically on to-do list, I want to search for work. I don't know that it works on multiple. It does. Like that, or if I said, work things, now it doesn't match.
So how does that? So what property is that? So so it's property name : thing I want to search for, right?
Yep.
And is that the property name that was generated in TypeScript? Is that case sensitive, or how does that play out?
No, it's not. I just typed that I typed it like that by habit. It has to be, whatever your property name in C# was, it can be any form of that. And in this case, this to-do space list is just splitting the Pascal case word on the words in the Pascal case words.
Gotcha. Okay, so it still requires, for somebody to do this, would still require some knowledge of what the backing property is for the object.
Right. Yeah. Hence admin pages.
Gotcha.
Yep. And a lot of times, it is fairly obvious. This is kind of a feature that wouldn't generally be used by general users if you were to expose the search on a custom page you wrote. Most users would never even think to try this. That ones that do might not get very far because they don't know what your properties are called. It's kind of a power user secret hidden feature more than anything. But some people do stumble across it. And it is nice to just have that work anyway.
Got it. Is there a way to turn that off if, for example, I have like colons in my data that I want people to actually be searching for?
What a great question. Not as like a super simple like Boolean flag or attribute or something, but that's a great segue into data sources. So what we can do, Coalesce kind of does all this stuff and exposes our data and sends it to the client, and the client can search and sort and filter it in kind of any way they want. In order to have some control over that, we can add a class to our entity here, and it can either be a nested class or it can live outside. If you don't make it nested, you have to add an additional attribute that says, hey, this is a data source for a to-do item. But if you just nest it, then you don't have to do that gymnastics. So we're going to inherit from the standard data source, which is kind of the place where pretty much all of the magic in terms of all the sorting, searching, filtering, there's another word there, that Coalesce does. Sorting. This is the class that does it. Yeah, sorting, thanks. This is the class that does it all. So if we do this, and our DB context is app DB context. So we define this class, make me a constructor. Then we got all these methods that we can override here. That are kind of the individual pieces that build up the query that we ultimately send off to Entity Framework, which it then turns to SQL and gives us results. So for example, to override the searching, we might override the apply list search term method and say, instead of your default behavior of doing kind of all that stuff and using the search attributes and all that kind of stuff, what I want you to do.
Which you can easily find on GitHub.
Yep. Or use the built-in decompiler in Visual Studio if you're exceptionally lazy. It's not the great, pretty code. The variables are all weird, but it's close enough. The searching is actually one of the most complex parts of what the data sources do. But if you do want to just kind of do your own custom searching, I'm just kind of override what Coalesce does by default and kind of, just ignore all the attributes. Just, I want to do my own thing here. Maybe I want to use a full text search and use the, ef dot functions dot using statement dot contains or dot free text. So the functions in EF that let you interact with SQL servers, full text search, if you wanted to use those instead, for example, then you could say, return query dot where item dot, it's probably like that, item dot description parameters dot search. So as an example, if you had set up full text indexes on this type, you could now though go and then say, hey, this is how I want to search on this thing.
So what is that parameters.search? That's what the user typed into the search bar?
Yep. So this filter parameters here is kind of all of the search field here. It's these. It will contain the pagination information. So this particular one, there's kind of 3 layers of these. So a filter parameter is a data source parameter with search and filter. This in particular just includes these 2 guys. So this one lets you pick, if you have multiple data sources, you can pick which one you want to use. This is kind of its whole own rabbit hole that you can read all about on the Coalesce docs, called the include string. Lets you kind of do some really easy property level trimming based on just a simple string that then matches against an attribute value that you might put on some of your properties. You can say, hey, in the browser, when I set my include string to, don't include the list, and then I put a corresponding attribute that says, hey, exclude this when my include string says don't include the list. It's just a really simple way of kind of doing some filtering there to reduce the the size of the payload going across the wire when you have properties that you don't necessarily need in a particular context.
Right, and the use case for that would be like, for example, if you had a page that was showing a particular object, and that object, and we actually had a case of this where there were literally 30 lines of includes for grabbing child and parent tables. And so you have this massive piece of data that's going back, and so if you use it in one case, you may want these 30, and in another case, you may want these 10. And so that way you have a really easy way to do that. You can just code that up, and you can either use a data source or the includes tree. There's a number of different ways to make it happen, but it's pretty nice to be able to do that, and you can do based on security context and a couple of different things on that.
Yep. And then there's another class of these parameters objects called iList parameters. And those are specifically when you're operating in an actual list, which has a notion of pagination and which has a notion of ordering.
Like in that
and this is the place. Yep. So this is the place where what page number you're asking for, how big, what fields do you want to sort by. Oh, yeah. And by the way, these you can click on the headers here to sort them. We kind of skipped over that, but. And once again, I mean, just like all the rest of this, that sorting is just being applied by a method here. In this case, there's one called apply list sorting, which then in turn either calls apply list default sorting or apply list client specified sorting, depending on whether the client did specify an ordering or not. So you can specify a default sort order, once again, with an attribute. So we can say, don't know why that is in the tooltips, that's the very last property, despite being the most useful one. So we can say, hey, by default, sort this one by descending, or actually more usefully, sort is done by, in this case, ascending. Because we want not done items first. We want the done items to kind of fall off to the bottom of a list.
Makes sense.
So the way to remember that is false is 0. So in ascending order, 0 comes before 1. So we want false first. Or we could have overridden that here with one of these methods on the data source. Now, this data source will only be picked up if you explicitly ask for it. So despite the name that I called this default source, this is not being picked up by default. It will only be picked up by Coalesce if you explicitly configure Coalesce to use it. And the way you would do that on your front end is you would come in here and say this .todo item list .data .params. I thought I had. Guess I didn't. I had a shortcut property for that. .params.data source equals new. And in this case, the data sources are actually in the model layer. So we need to-do item from the models. So we need to-do item data sources, which doesn't exist because I haven't run the code generation yet. So we could stop that. Just really quickly run that. Our C# has errors. We have a stray bracket on line 64. Open paren, close paren. It's the file not saved. That'll do it.
Almost needs like that little asterisk needs to be a big red circle.
Yeah. If only I could detect what files are saved or not saved in Visual Studio from this command line application. So that's now there. So now we come back here and we see, we can say .data sources, .default source. So that's just a class that we can instantiate and then associate like that. So that's one way to pick the data source. And then if I had multiple, they would all be in here and I could pick among them. Maybe I want to use one data source on one page and one data source on some other page. But say that I'm using this data source to apply some kind of security trimming, for example. I don't want people to be able to bypass this and say, hey, use the out-of-the-box one with Coalesce that doesn't apply kind of my row-level security. What we can do is we can just say default data source. And what this attribute does is says this data source replaces the default out-of-the-box behavior by Coalesce. The default out-of-the-box behavior can now never be exposed. You're always operating through this data source or some other data source that you've defined. And ideally, if you do define other ones, you would just inherit from this guy if this is the one where you apply your security trimming. So an example of that security trimming, and again, this is kind of row level security. So who can see which specific rows? This isn't kind of class level security where we can say who can see to-do items, period. Right? We might, say, hey, only admins can see to-do items. And then regardless of whether it's to-do item number 1 or number 2, it's just only admins can see it.
So just to talk about that a little bit, you have that level, which is going to put it on the properties in the API, like Andrew's showing right now. You then have individual property level, which is going to put it in your DTOs, so it'll do trimming specifically. So if a particular role can't see a particular property, that will get security trimmed. So the assigned to variable will automatically be not included, and it can't be updated unless your role is admin. And then you can do like what Andrew showed, which is actual row level security down in the bottom level, down in the data source. And we haven't even gotten into the behaviors yet.
So we can say, where, item dot assigned to ID equals user dot get user.
Right. Maybe except if they're an admin, then they can see everybody.
Right. Or user dot is in role admin. Types, that's a string. That's an int. Yeah, we'll just pretend that our types match. So this is saying, so this get query method is kind of the base. So this is kind of where everything starts, and then all the searching and sorting and filtering and paging are all applied on top of this query. And so the get query is kind of the almost always when you write a custom data source, you're overriding this method and doing something with it, whether that be adding some additional include with Entity Framework to say, hey, go grab this other related object when you query for these. So we can say item list. By default, Coalesce includes all immediate relations of a type. So it's going to pull back the to-do list and the application user by default. So it will, this base.getQuery is what does that. So you could bypass that and just go directly against db.toDoItems and kind of bypass that default behavior of the getQuery method, which is the only thing it does by default is does these first level immediate relation includes with Entity Framework. So if we did that, and now we have this as the default source. Oh, I just opened Edge again.
I'm just considering that a Freudian slip.
Oh yeah. I really want to open Edge. I just want to do everything in Edge. How about we do that? Now if we misclick, we'll just open Chrome. I meant to start the app, but what I actually did was run the code gen, because that was my last command that I ran, which was a good thing because we needed to run the code gen. Happy little accident there.
Bob Ross.
What this is going to do is give us no items in the list now because of that security terming and the fact that we don't actually have users.
And because you replaced the default data source with that other attribute, right?
Yep. So it's now forcing the code to go through that path, and that path is doing a check on a user ID that is. Oh, actually, we didn't even get that far. So we get an access denied on that because of the class level attributes that I added here.
Because we're not signed in with a user right now at all, right? We're effectively anonymous.
We are. So inside the template, just as a kind of thing that gets you up and running, there's this dummy authentication middleware that automatically signs you in as a user called development user. The reason we do this is because by default, everything in Coalesce is secured. You have to be logged in. You can, on a type-by-type basis, say, hey, it's okay if completely anonymous, non-authenticated users can read this, but by default, we require you to be logged in. So this is here to kind of so you can kind of get started quickly. If the first thing that you don't want to tackle is the very first thing in your brand new Coalesce application is adding a bunch of authentication stuff, which is kind of boring. If you kind of just want to get started on your data model and worry about your authentication later, especially if your authentication is dependent on your data model, right? Then it's kind of you want to be able to get going and get something out there. But this is one of the steps on this homepage here where we kind of include some like first steps that you want to do. This is the third and final one that you're supposed to do.
Don't ship your app with the dummy auth left in.
Right. And if if you ever intend to add any auth to your app, you're going to very quickly notice that dummy auth is there, because you're going to say, why am I not being challenged for a login screen or what have you? Why are all of my users called development user?
Does Coalesce have sort of
we felt it was pretty safe to leave that
built-in login stuff? Does it gen out like login page stuff for you if that wasn't in there?
No, it doesn't. So that for that piece we delegate to ASP.NET Core Identity, which does.
Got it. Okay.
Those won't be view pages. They'll just be, in this case now, it's all based on Razor pages, and I think it's styled with Bootstrap. But that's kind of what you get out of the box. If you do want to do some custom stuff, then it's kind of up to you to do that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the most that I would really ever go for is like a custom login screen, maybe a custom sign-up screen if you let just public users sign up for your app. That's kind of the most that I would probably do is like custom view apps just to kind of keep the styling consistent. But if you go like, setting up two-factor authentication and all that kind of stuff and user management, password reset and all that kind of stuff, I say, hey, just use the out-of-the-box identity stuff or expose all that stuff as custom methods in Coalesce that you access through your admin pages, and you have some kind of admin user who manages the user, which is kind of the case that's been more common with a lot of the apps we've built, is that they're kind of not apps where users are self-servicing. It's kind of a scenario where there are internal line of business apps where there's some person in control who is the one who goes and creates users and manages the users and so on.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
So Andrew, what would you say would be the sweet spots for if somebody's saying, hey, should I use Coalesce for an app or not? When is it really going to be a win for them? When have we seen that be true?
So one case is whenever you're writing an internet app, I think it's a great win. An internet line of business app where you have just kind of lots of data that you're just managing, forms. Even if you don't have a lot of that stuff, if maybe it's very configuration heavy, where you have a lot of knobs and levers that you need to be tweakable, and that configuration gets saved into a database. I say that's a very useful scenario. One case to be wary of using Coalesce, and not saying that you can't do it in this scenario, but just that you kind of have to tread carefully, just because kind of a lot of what Coalesce does is kind of exposes things by default to logged in users. And so if you have an application where you allow public users to just sign in or sign up for accounts on their own and sign into your application, you just have to be extra diligent to make sure that you secure everything, either with your class-based attributes or your row-level security or whatever kind of thing makes sense for the application that you're building.
Yeah, just like you would normally have to, but you just got to be careful that you don't expose things that you don't want to, especially if you're in like a multi-tenant situation or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it certainly can be used that way, and we saw here, with the attribute security and the row level security with the data sources, that you certainly can achieve that level of security.
Yeah, just be careful.
You just have to be diligent and make sure to test things well, as you would with any other application. It's the only difference is that kind of when you start with a bare bones ASP.NET Core application and you're building everything yourself by hand manually, nothing is exposed by default. Whereas Coalesce, it's kind of you build your data model and then you get all this really cool, awesome stuff, which is great and it's super helpful. It's just that kind of then you have to take the approach where you kind of got to go, okay, let's say, scale this back a little bit.
Right.
You users over here, you can't do that. Whereas with an internet app, it's kind of a whole lot less of an issue. Generally there's already a pretty high level of trust there. When you're working within some organization, you're only allowing users within that organization to get into the app in the first place.
Right, and in those cases, especially where you have something that's higher security, we'd probably recommend just going ahead and writing services that support all your data. That's probably going to be the best route for some public-facing stuff, which kind of depends.
Yeah. And that's what we did with one of the apps that we wrote most recently with Coalesce that did have a public-facing component, is that all of the public-facing interactions are done through service classes with very well-defined interfaces, and then basically everything else in Coalesce is completely walled off.
Yep. And to touch on something just somewhat tangentially, but because you're writing essentially back-end code, and then you're writing very front-end code, that code is usually pretty easy to test. Like writing tests are fairly straightforward when you're not writing against things like controllers and APIs that require potentially a lot of authorization and a lot of context into them in order to get them to work. You can easily test your back end, and then you can easily test your front end just using some basic tools. And so I think getting pretty good unit testing coverage is much simpler across your specific code, assuming that you're probably not going to be doing a lot of testing of generated code, but something like an integration test would easily test the whole stack very, very quickly.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Kevin, anything else before we wrap up? There's a bunch of other stuff. If people are interested, we could go and talk about various, talk about Roslyn. We could talk about the whole tree trimming stuff that we did with the includes tree. There's a number of different pieces, how some of the front end components work and how to do code generation. There's a whole model piece that is just the back end that will go through and build a model of your application at compile time and at runtime. And it's actually one component that can work off of a compile time or a runtime model and produce a single usable API model for you, a consumable model for a developer. So anyway, there's just a bunch of stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah, no, I think what I would say is
we also did
if people find this interesting and want to know more, drop me a line in the comments, and I'm sure Grant and Andrew.
We'll send you Andrew's phone number.
I was going to say, I'm sure I can probably con Grant and Andrew into coming back on again. Hopefully. I didn't scare them too badly. But no, I think this is great. I will probably be asking you guys some questions because I've got an app that I'm going to actually dabble with and try using Coalesce for and see how it goes. And given my incredible lack of web skills, I am sure I will have questions. But thank you guys for both being willing to come on. Andrew, thank you for going through and doing the driving and for your insane level of expertise when it comes to all of this Coalesce stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. With that, I think...
Sure. Hey, thanks a lot, Kevin.
No. So I think with that, we will probably sign off. If people have questions, drop us a line in the comments. We can see about doing more ASP.NET Core stuff or web stuff and maybe dive more into this Coalesce stuff. Or if you're using it and you've got questions or problems, definitely leave us a line. I'm going to drop a link to the website in there. Side note, Andrew, it looks like the website's versioning of what it shows for ASP.NET Core and EF Core probably could use some updates. There's a lot of 2s and not a lot of 3s.
Yeah, the whole website could use an update, or rewrite, or replacement.
We got to put that on the list of stuff for interns to do.
That's a weird way to spell Cameron. So,
actually, it sounds like a great thing for somebody who's new to the Coalesce view stack to build something
before they build something in production for themselves.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a Kevin guy or something.
So what you're saying is we need to do this. I'll see how brave I get. If I get brave enough, maybe I'll stream me muddling my way through, and you guys can have a good laugh watching it.
Well, and the hopeful thing is that we want to build a site that has the demo site should have good examples of what you do to build out all these different things, and that's really what the whole idea is so that people have somewhere to go to say, hey, I want to do this. How do I do that? And there's an example of it.
Well, cool. Once again, I will say thank you guys very much for coming on. For everyone who stuck with us for a good 2.5 hours solid, thank you for coming and hanging out. We'll say happy coding. We'll see everybody again next week.
Thanks, guys.